The stretch of coastline from Tillamook Bay in Oregon to the northern tip of Vancouver Island is known as the Graveyard of the Pacific. This deadly reputation started as soon as European explorers began widely navigating the area in the 18th century. Violent currents, treacherous coastlines, and notoriously unpredictable weather make this one of the deadliest stretches of coastline in the world. The tragedies of the past remain close to mariners in the area, but one of these tragedies, the wreck of the SS Valencia, stands out from countless other disasters. The horrific death of her passengers and crew lingers in the fog, haunting the area to this day. In 1839, the Red D Line began operating a shipping service between New York and Venezuela. By 1879, the well-established company decided to modernize their fleet and ordered 2 steamships from William Cramp & Sons in Philadelphia. The first of these 2 liners, the Caracas, was completed in 1881, and her sister ship, the Valencia, was completed in 1882. The Valencia was a single-screw steamer with 3 decks and a gross tonnage of 1,598. She was 252 feet long with a beam of 34 feet. She was licensed to carry 286 passengers and was equipped with what was considered adequate safety equipment for the time, including 6 lifeboats, 1 workboat, and 4 life rafts. Her maiden voyage took place in May 1882. The 2 ships would operate together until the Caracas was sold in 1888 to the Oregon Pacific Railroad Company. She would be renamed the Aquina Bay and would ironically run aground in the bay she was renamed after later that year. Not a great sign for moving these ships to the Pacific Northwest. The Valencia would continue with the Red D Line for another decade. In 1897, she was attacked by a Spanish cruiser off Guantanamo Bay for not flying the American flag, but she escaped without any major damage. In 1898, she was sold to the Pacific Steam Whaling Company. She was brought around Cape Horn to the west coast, where she would sail between San Francisco and the territory of Alaska. Later that year, she was briefly chartered by the United States Army during the Spanish-American War. After her return to civilian service, she ran into some legal trouble, due to some light embezzlement, and was sold to the Pacific Coast Steamship Company, where she continued offering passenger voyages between California and Alaska. The Valencia was not a well-loved ship. She was small and slow with a service speed of only 11 knots. She was designed for warmer climates and not well suited to the harsh weather of the Pacific Northwest, making for cold, damp voyages. She was also a bit difficult to operate. Her 100-foot bow was too long and gave her bridge poor visibility, especially in foggy conditions. Waves crashing on her bow were unusually loud to the point where it made communication among crew members difficult. And though she was equipped with the required safety features, she lacked a double bottom and proper hull compartmentalization that could slow flooding in an emergency. She was an unlucky ship and suffered a series of collisions and groundings after 1902. By the winter season of 1905, she spent most of her time docked in San Francisco and was only used as a backup vessel. The Valencia's final voyage came in 1906 when she was pulled to service the San Francisco to Seattle route to replace the SS City of Puebla while she was undergoing repairs after running aground on the Columbia Bar. Her captain was Oscar Marcus Johnson, a Norwegian man with only 4 years' experience sailing the area. The ship departed San Francisco on January 20th with 9 officers, 56 crew members, and at least 108 passengers. At first, she experienced fair weather, but as she passed Cape Mendocino the next day, conditions deteriorated with strong winds and low visibility. As they proceeded up the coast, the crew relied on a method of navigation called dead reckoning to determine their position. This method used a device towed behind the ship to calculate the distance traveled through water. It requires precise calculations, and factors like wind and currents had to be accurately accounted for. Captain Johnson was said to have had a poor understanding of the complex currents in the area, most notably the Davidson Current, which runs north along the western coast of the United States. These currents were clearly indicated on pilot charts of the North Pacific Ocean, but inexplicably, No such charts were on board the Valencia. This meant Captain Johnson's calculations of the ship's speed were off by 1 to 3 knots. Believing they were several miles south of their actual position at 9 p.m. on January 22nd, Captain Johnson ordered the ship turned eastward toward the coast to enter the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Heavy rain, wind, and fog led to extremely poor visibility. Captain Johnson ordered constant soundings, a customary practice at the time to pick up the strait. Obtaining a sounding of 60 fathoms at 10 p.m., he changed course, turning slightly west, the usual course taken from the Umatilla lightship to Cape Flattery, a location they were actually several miles north of. As they continued, the soundings grew increasingly shallow. 40 fathoms at 11:15, then 30 fathoms at 11:30. The rapid shallowing should have been a clear warning that something was wrong. By 11:35, Captain Johnson finally caught on that they were not where he thought they were. He changed course once again, but he still had no idea where they were. At 11:45, soundings gave an alarming 24 fathoms. Minutes later, Second Officer Pedersen, who was on the bridge with the captain, spotted a dark object looming dead ahead. No signal came from the lookout, who must have been asleep at the time. Pedersen alerted Captain Johnson, who ordered the wheel hard over, but it was too late. The Valencia violently smashed into an underwater reef just before midnight, 11 miles from Cape Beale on the southwest coast of Vancouver Island. Captain Johnson exclaimed, "My God, where are we?" as his ship ground helplessly into the rocky shoreline. The Valencia immediately began taking on water, reportedly 1 foot every minute. Knowing the ship would soon founder, Captain Johnson ordered her run aground to keep her from fully sinking. She ended up with her stern dug into the rocks and her bow pointing out to sea. Though they were less than 14 to 18 meters from the shore, they could not have beached in a worse area. Lighthouses were established in the area at Cape Beale to the north in 1874 and Carmana Point to the south in 1891. But the stretch between the two lights was still woefully underprotected, and multiple ships wrecked in the desolate area every year. The coastline had no beach, just 30-meter cliffs that jutted directly out of the crashing waves. The Valencia's generator quickly failed, plunging the ship into darkness. She was not equipped with a radio to call for help, and it would be over 15 hours before anyone from the outside world would learn of the disaster. In the moments immediately after the collision, panic and confusion overtook the passengers and crew. Captain Johnson knew that the lifeboats had little chance of safely making it to shore, and it would be safer to remain on the stricken ship until help could arrive or a line could be established to the shore. But inexplicably, he still ordered the lifeboats swung out and lowered to the saloon deck rail, though he explicitly ordered that they not be launched. Panicked passengers rushed to fill the tiny boats. In the chaos, shouts were heard calling on the lifeboats to be launched, and the davit crews, unsure where the orders came from, began launching the boats. All 6 lifeboats were launched within half an hour. 3 of these boats either collapsed or were upended during lowering, throwing around 46 people into the water. All but 1 crewman quickly drowned in the turbulent waters. The other 3 lifeboats successfully launched with another 50 people. 1 quickly disappeared, her fate unknown, and the other 2 capsized in the violent sea. Only 12 men from these boats made it to shore, but 1 man was swept back out to sea after clinging to a rock, and 2 others were forced up the face of a cliff by the rising tide, where they eventually fell to their deaths. The remaining 9 men spent the rest of the night huddled among the rocks. This group would become known as the Bunker Party, led by Frank F. Bunker, who was en route to Seattle to become assistant superintendent of the city's schools. His wife and 2 children were among those lost in the lifeboats. Meanwhile, back on the ship, the initial panic had subsided among the nearly 100 left on board. Captain Johnson fired off rockets in an attempt to signal help, apparently severely injuring his hand in the process. The Valencia was equipped with a Lyle gun that could shoot a line that could be used to establish a breacher's buoy. In the morning light at approximately 8 a.m., Captain Johnson decided that they would try to launch the last boat so someone could at least get to shore and secure the line. At first, Boatswain Timothy J. McCarthy was the only one willing to brave what had already killed nearly a third of the people on the ship. But finally, 5 more crewmen volunteered. The boat was successfully launched, and the men barely survived as they desperately paddled for a safe place to land. They finally made it to shore at around 12:30 p.m., a full 8 miles northwest of the wreck. McCarthy and the other exhausted men attempted to find a path back to the Valencia, but they couldn't find a way through the dense forest. Finally, they found a small, poorly maintained trail on the beach with a sign that read 3 miles to Cape Beale. They hiked to the lighthouse, and the station keeper contacted nearby Banfield, but news of the wreck had already been received. Unbeknownst to McCarthy and those still trapped on the Valencia, the bunker party climbed the bluffs at daybreak and stumbled upon the Carmana-Cape Beale telegraph line. They followed the telegraph line south through a thick forest until they finally came upon a lineman's shack, where they were able to tap into the line and contact the Carmana Point light station. 15 hours after the wreck, word of what happened finally reached Victoria, British Columbia. 2 Pacific Coast Steamship Company ships, the SS Queen and the SS City of Topeka, were dispatched from Seattle, with the Queen departing first. A Canadian salvage steamer, Salver, and another tugboat, the Tsar, joined the search party. Together with the SS Queen, the 3 ships finally located the Valencia on Wednesday morning. Remember, the Valencia wrecked on Monday evening. But the Queen was too large to get any closer than a mile away from the wreck. By this point, the Valencia was breaking up in the pounding waves, with nearly 100 survivors still clinging to her decks and fixtures. The people on board saw the 3 ships approaching and fired the Lyle gun 3 times to signal the rescuers, as hope swelled that they would soon be saved. The shallow-bottom Tsar was able to get closer to the Valencia, but turned back due to the dangerous conditions. Inexplicably, they reported that they saw no survivors on the wreck, though people were clearly visible even to the SS Queen a mile away. The Tsar and Salver, the 2 vessels capable of getting close to the wreck, made the unthinkable decision to head back to Victoria. Meanwhile, the Queen soon lost sight of the wreck as the weather again began to deteriorate. On board the Valencia, the 2 remaining life rafts were hastily prepared. The first departed with 10 men on board. The captain and remaining crew pleaded with the surviving women to climb on board the second tiny life raft, but the horrors of the previous evening, and maybe the hope that the distant steamship would soon save them, kept the women from taking a chance on the craft. Eventually, it left, loaded with 18 men. The women on board reportedly sang "Nearer My God to Thee" as the rafts desperately paddled for the now out-of-sight steamship. At 11 a.m., the city of Topeka arrived on the scene. Inexplicably, the general manager of the Pacific Coast Steamship Company, James E. Farrow, who was on board the Topeka, ordered the captain of the Queen to return to Victoria and board passengers for her regularly scheduled voyage. As the day went on, the weather worsened, and the Topeka slowly and cautiously patrolled the coast, looking for the wreck. At 1 p.m., she came upon the second life raft with 18 men on board, including Second Officer Pedersen. The men were nearly dead when they were finally rescued. The first life raft was less lucky, drifting 18 miles northwest, past Cape Beale and into the Barkley Sound. They landed on a small island late Wednesday night. 2 men fell overboard and drowned, and 4 died of exposure on the island. The 4 who survived wandered the island all day Thursday until they finally were discovered and rescued. The last hope of rescue for those still on board the Valencia was just as bafflingly pathetic as the rescue ships. Immediately after hearing what was happening on Tuesday afternoon, a group of 3 left Carmana Light to aid in the rescue. They took with them only about 100 feet of rope. On Tuesday night, they set up camp by a river and didn't resume again until 9:30 a.m. Wednesday morning. They then stopped for tea at around noon at a Nuchanoth encampment, only a few miles away from the wreck, while the people still on board watched the 3 rescue ships sail away. That afternoon, they finally reached a bluff and spotted the wreck. They reported that the people saw them and cheered, but unbelievably, no further communication was made, and even more unbelievably, no attempt was made to establish a lifeline between the wreck and the shore. The three men just stood and watched for an hour, bearing witness to the moment when the vessel finally wrecked apart, spilling people into the violent waters. Most still wore their life jackets, and those that weren't smashed on the rocks were carried out to sea by the currents. The rescue party, having rescued nobody, left the bluff while the remaining victims of the Valencia were still clinging to life in the icy sea. None would survive. The ship remained intact for nearly 40 hours after she wrecked, with survivors clinging to her till the end. Bad luck, paired with ineptitude and indifference, doomed the people on board to an agonizing, drawn-out end. Estimates vary, but the official federal report put the death toll at 136 people. Only 37 men lived through the ordeal. Every woman and child on board the Valencia wouldn't survive. Even before the wreck of the Valencia broke up, the press began covering the tragic story. Coverage quickly shifted to outrage as details of the botched rescue efforts came to light. Multiple inquiries were initiated by the United States and Canada, including one personally ordered by President Theodore Roosevelt. They determined that the incident was the result of navigational mistakes and poor weather. The Valencia was equipped with adequate safety equipment, but the crew never carried out a lifeboat drill, no doubt contributing to the disastrous mistakes made launching the lifeboats. And though the inquiries were critical of the failed rescue efforts, they ultimately determined that the rescuers did what they could given the circumstances. The lack of life-saving infrastructure on Vancouver Island came under great scrutiny. Following the report's recommendations, a new lighthouse, Pachina Point, was commissioned and built between Cape Beale and Carmana Point in 1908. They also recommended the creation of a life-saving trail with regularly spaced shelters for shipwrecked sailors. The trail would be completed in 1911 and later became known as the West Coast Trail. Surf boats and additional vessels capable of rescue were also permanently stationed near the area. All of these provisions undoubtedly made the area safer, but the tragic missteps of the SS Valencia would go on to haunt the area for generations. Ghostly sightings of the Valencia started even before the deadly disaster came to an end. While the city of Topeka was on her way back to Seattle with the tiny handful of survivors, the ship briefly paused to relay the details of the tragedy to another passing vessel. A man stood on the ship's stern surveying the dark, misty waters. The horrors that took place only a few miles away were no doubt drifting through his mind. Suddenly, something in the distance caught his eye. There, in the low-hanging smoke that spewed from the Topeka's funnel, he could just barely make out the dark outline of another liner approaching in the distance. He turned to see if anyone on deck could help identify the vessel, but he found no one close. When he looked back, the strange vessel was gone. Soon the city of Topeka was again underway. The man wondered if what he saw was really another ship or just the fog playing tricks on his mind. Then, a commotion on the forward deck grabbed his attention. He ran forward to find the other men on deck pointing to something just off the port bow. His heart stopped when he saw what they were looking at. Running nearly parallel to the city of Topeka was another vessel that seemed to have come out of nowhere. The men on board the Topeka let out a horrified gasp when they drew close enough to make out the lettering on her hull. It was the Valencia, piloted by some unseen force. The Topeka attempted to signal the phantom ship, but just as soon as she appeared, she vanished in the rocks on the shore. 6 months after the disaster, a local Nuchanith fisherman and his wife were exploring the shore of Pachina Bay when they came upon a hidden sea cave obstructed by a large boulder. When they peered inside, they saw a lifeboat with 8 skeletons, trapped floating in the watery darkness below. It's believed that a high tide lifted the small boat into the mouth of the cave, and the heavy seas trapped them inside. Whether what they saw that day was one of Valencia's 6 lifeboats is unknown, but it's hard to believe any remained floating long enough in the stormy sea to make it into the mouth of that cave. The Valencia was also just one of several wrecks in the area around this time. Only a few months earlier, another vessel wrecked in almost the same spot, and a lifeboat involved in the rescue effort also went missing. So it's possible this doomed lifeboat could have actually come from another wreck. The dangerous seas made the cave incredibly difficult to access and made any recovery attempt impossible. But that wasn't the last or even the most amazing sighting involving one of Valencia's lifeboats. In 1933, a derelict lifeboat was found floating in Berkeley Sound. When the lifeboat was pulled ashore and examined, the nameplate was still clearly legible. It was the Valencia's No. 5 lifeboat, somehow still in decent condition, 27 years after the disaster. The nameplate can still be found displayed at the Maritime Museum of British Columbia. How the tiny craft survived nearly 3 decades is a complete mystery. These are just some of the strange stories of the Valencia. Apparently, at least for a time, whenever mariners in the area thought they saw a phantom ship in the dark mist, they would always say it was the Valencia, reenacting the deadly night she ran aground. There are even reports of ghostly lifeboats appearing in the distance, only to fade into the mist. Pieces of her wreck are still visible today, but the area remains difficult to access due to the rough terrain. The story of the Valencia lingers on. In an area famous for shipwrecks and watery death, her story stands out from the countless others. Her wreck likely kept many in the area awake at night, wondering if they could have done more. Ghosts are the lives we couldn't save. In 1906, death was closer, especially for those who ventured to the edges of the map. Accidents and disasters were more common. People died young. With so much uncertainty, it's hard not to look out into the fog and wonder, why am I here? When will my time come? Could I have done more? Late one night in October 1918, a Canadian Pacific steamship called the Princess Sophia grounded on Vanderbilt Reef near Juneau, Alaska. The following day, several rescue ships arrived on the scene, but the Sophia's captain declined to order an evacuation, even during the brief windows of calm weather. As conditions deteriorated and night fell again, the rescue ships were sent away. When they returned the next morning, the Princess Sophia was gone, having dislodged from her perch on the rocks and sunk. Only her forward mast was still visible. The tragedy killed all 364 people on board, making it the deadliest maritime accident in the history of Alaska and British Columbia. It's widely believed that the Princess Sophia's captain hesitated to order an evacuation because fresh in his mind was an earlier disaster in which a hasty evacuation ordered by a frantic and incompetent captain proved a deadly mistake. In August 1894, a man named Charles Peabody and 5 other associates formed the Alaska Steamship Company to transport passengers and cargo to the District of Alaska. Their business greatly expanded with the Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 and in 1902, the company started a long-haul ferry service between Port Townsend, Washington, and Victoria, British Columbia. This subsidiary was called the Puget Sound Navigation Company and was often referred to as the Black Ball Line. A series of modest wooden steamships were ordered to service the new route. One of these new ships was the SS Clallam, built in 1903 by the Edward Heath Shipyard in Tacoma, Washington. Her hull was constructed from Douglas fir, and when completed, she came in at 657 tons and measured 186 feet long with a beam of 32 feet. She was powered by an 800 horsepower compound engine that drove a single propeller with a reported cruising speed of 13 knots, though in reality, she struggled to ever make it above 10. She featured a promenade deck, saloons, and 44 staterooms with a license to carry 350 passengers. The Clallam was plagued with unlucky omens from the moment she was launched on April 15, 1903. Hazel Behan, said to be the most popular girl in the area, was elected by the people of Clallam County, Washington, to christen the new ship. Despite Hazel's popularity, the Clallam began moving down the slipway before she was ready. She desperately grabbed the champagne bottle that hung by a ribbon from the ship's bow and wildly swung, missing widely. As it swung back, she tried again, but still missed. Finally, in frustration, she threw a nearby hammer at the rapidly retreating bottle, but this again missed, leaving the vessel unchristened. Here's a local newspaper roasting her for the mishap 61 years later. Brutal. Although she does sound like she was a pretty cool person. After the launch, when the stars and stripes were raised on the new ship, they were accidentally raised upside down, the international signal of distress. But the Alaska Steamship Company seemed confident in their new ship, carrying only collision and fire insurance, but no insurance against wreckage. And while the company had a somewhat solid safety record, the Clallam lacked even the legally required distress rockets. She entered service on July 3, 1903, and was captained by 53-year-old George Roberts, one of the co-founders of the Alaska Steamship Company. While Roberts was a veteran West Coast mariner, his record wasn't without incident, having wrecked a vessel called the Dorego near Juneau a few years earlier. The Clallam had a rocky start, suffering a number of issues, including a cracked rudder and engine troubles. In December 1903, her engines failed, sending the vessel drifting towards some rocks. Captain Roberts was apparently slow to respond to the impending disaster, and the situation was only resolved when the engine miraculously restarted at the last minute, narrowly avoiding disaster. This moment of luck was rare for the Clallam, and less than a month later, the omens that hung over her launch would soon come to pass. Before her final voyage, the Clallam saw one last ominous premonition. At the time, it was common for the Black Ball Line to carry livestock. A trained mascot, called a bell sheep, was used to lead the herd onto the ship. It was said that before her final voyage, the Clallam's bell sheep absolutely refused to board the ship and was finally left behind. On Friday, January 8, 1904, the Clallam left Seattle. She made a brief stop at Port Townsend and was scheduled to reach Victoria just after 3 p.m. As she didn't operate on the high seas of the outer coast, little care was taken in loading her cargo, which included various types of meat, 24 bales of mattresses, 140 empty kegs, various metals, and 500 slabs of oil cake, which were bars of vegetable fat used as animal feed. While the weather in Seattle was fair, a gust had already picked up and the water was choppy as the Clallam's passengers boarded. They represented all walks of life. Lenora Richards was a prominent businesswoman and co-owner of a prosperous copper mine. She was also the first woman to climb Mount Sicker on Vancouver Island. Jessie Gallatly and her daughter Jeannie were returning home from a visit to the Green River Hot Springs in Washington. Samuel and Eleanor Bolton had married in December and were returning home to Victoria from their honeymoon. Edward Lannon and Mary Reynolds were close childhood friends who were traveling to Victoria for their wedding after their recent engagement. Louise Harris was a prominent 20-year-old Spokane socialite who was visiting friends in Seattle and nearly missed the Clallam, arriving only moments before her lines were cast off. A 20-year-old waitress, Minnie Murdoch, was traveling to visit friends in Victoria. Albert K. Prince and Guy L. Daniels were vaudeville performers heading to a one-night show. In a letter to his sister not long before the voyage, Prince mentioned that a fortune teller in British Columbia told him that death would suddenly find him on the water, though he wasn't bothered by this ominous prediction. Thomas Solons, his wife Delhi, and their 3 young children also joined at Port Townsend, heading home after a family visit to Delhi's niece. It's difficult to account for everyone who was on the voyage. Passenger manifests were sloppy, and several passengers that we know were on board weren't recorded. Children were also often left off the manifest, and it's assumed there were more on board than the 4 that were recorded. A storm warning was raised as the Clallam left Port Townsend Harbor, and the weather was already taking a turn for the worse. Only a few minutes after their departure, the storm overtook the tiny ship. Massive waves crashed over her decks, and nearly all of her passengers fell ill in the heavy seas. As the ship rolled, saloon steward Archibald King passed through the engine room and noticed water on the boiler room floor. Confused by the sight, he watched as the water sloshed from side to side, but he eventually headed back to the dining saloon to resume his duties, assuming the situation was under control. Meanwhile, on the bridge, Captain Roberts was struggling to keep the ship heading into the wind, leaving the heavy seas pounding into her side. Eventually, the force was too much, and a porthole broke open, sending water flooding into the ship. Chief Engineer Scott Delaney called up to the captain, pleading with him to keep the ship heading into the wind to slow the flooding. But again, the captain failed to regain control, and the situation rapidly deteriorated. The 8-inch porthole, also known as a scuttle, was equipped with a hinged metal cover called a deadlight that could be used to cover the opening in just such an event. But First Officer George Donny would later testify that the deadlight broke a month before, and while the chief engineer promised to fix it, he hadn't done so by the time of the storm. He now struggled to fix a wooden plug over the breach, but nothing would hold. More men were sent down to help the situation, and Delaney went to start the circulating pump to control the inflow of water, but to his horror, he found that the pump wasn't working. Mattresses, blankets, and everything else the crew could think of were used to try and slow the flooding, but the situation grew more hopeless by the minute. On the bridge, Captain Roberts was still struggling to keep the ship on course, but he was failing badly. This might have been due to something that happened just after the ship left Port Townsend. Moments after the ship departed, deckhand Richard S. Griffith was in the crew quarters when he heard a crashing noise above him in the cargo hold. When he went to investigate, he found that the freight in the main deck had shifted to starboard. He summoned a few other men and they struggled to rebalance the cargo as the ship rocked violently, sending coal and oil cakes everywhere. Captain Roberts finally went below to inspect the damage, but by this time, the broken porthole was well underwater, making it impossible to plug. When he entered the engine rooms, he found 3 to 4 feet of water, high enough to spill into the fireboxes, extinguishing the flames. In a panic, Roberts raced topside, convinced that his vessel was only moments away from foundering. His next decisions would prove fatal. While chaos was unfolding below decks, the Clallam's seasick passengers were unaware of the unfolding danger. John Davis was sitting on deck at the time, trying to calm his stomach, when he saw a man race on deck wearing a life preserver. Davis and another passenger laughed at the sight, thinking the man was overreacting to the storm. As passengers were slowly realizing the severity of the situation, saloon steward Archibald King was going stateroom to stateroom handing out life preservers. In one cabin, he found a little boy sleeping in one of the berths. He did his best to wrap the child in an adult-sized life preserver and carried him on deck. The Clallam was not equipped with child-sized life preservers. By this time, she was listing dangerously, and the water was nearly level with her main deck. With the storm still raging, Captain Roberts, who was reportedly very excited at the time, ordered the lifeboats lowered. Most of the trained crew was still below trying to plug the leak, including First Officer George Donny, who ordinarily would have overseen the evacuation. Instead, these duties fell on Purser F.C. Freer, stewards, and untrained passengers. In the chaos as they loaded lifeboat number 1, passenger Jeannie Gallantly was thrown into a railing as the ship lurched to starboard, crushing the left side of her face. Bleeding heavily, she tried to stay on the ship, but she was forced into the small boat. Once loaded, the inexperienced men lowered the boat so fast that there was no time to retrieve the oars or get the drain plug in place. A passenger named Captain Thomas was put in charge. While he had sailing experience, he didn't know anything about this type of lifeboat. Only moments after reaching the water, the boat capsized, spilling everyone into the churning sea. Captain Thomas and a few others managed to resurface, and deckhand Richard Griffiths threw him a line to climb back on board. but the captain was pulled under when another man in the water grabbed his legs. The next boat to launch was lifeboat number 3, which was loaded with the remaining women and children, including Samuel Bolton's wife. He would board lifeboat number 5, which was filled with men. As they began lowering, Bolton watched as his wife's boat disappeared around the stern. Suddenly, a huge wave slammed into his boat, throwing everyone into the water. Bolton was thrown into the side of the ship, and at the last minute he caught hold of a rope that he and a few others were able to use to climb back on deck. As soon as he regained his footing, Bolton was told that his wife's boat also overturned, drowning everyone on board. Overwhelmed with grief, he had to be held back from jumping into the water. Passenger Charles G. Bennett was ordered to help repair the portside lifeboats, but after what happened to the 3 starboard boats, no other boats were launched. Passenger William King later said, "Never as long as I live shall I forget the indescribable horror of the moments which followed the launching of the lifeboats. The crying of the women and children, the shouting of the officers giving orders, the calling of the farewells to loved ones left behind, and the waves dashing around the fated vessel. In those few moments of chaos, every single woman and child on board the Clallam lost their life." With 3 lifeboats gone, the men left on board the Clallam desperately searched for a way to slow the sinking. In an echo of the ship's ominous launch, someone turned her ensign upside down to signal distress, but when Captain Roberts saw the signal, he demanded it taken down, seemingly in some sort of denial of the dire situation. The captain's poor judgment was on display throughout the ordeal. When the ship began taking on water, deck boy Harold Jensen recommended that they throw cargo overboard to lighten the ship, but the captain ignored the recommendation. Now, with respect for the captain dwindling, Jensen and the rest of the crew began unloading every piece of cargo they could find to help keep the doomed ship afloat as long as possible. While earlier she seemed only moments away from foundering, as dusk began to fall, the Clallam was proving herself more seaworthy than expected. First Officer Donnie and deckhand Richard Griffiths attempted to get the pumps working by hand, but when they proved useless, Griffiths suggested that they form bailing brigades to slow the flooding. Soon, every passenger and crew left on the ship formed 3 crews, 1 forward, 1 aft, and 1 midship, and began the difficult task of passing buckets of water from the lower decks up and out of the ship, buying valuable time as they waited for rescue. By this point, the oil cakes from the cargo hold had moistened, and while most of them had already been thrown overboard, their slippery residue remained all over the deck, making the task of bailing water even more challenging as the night dragged on. Earlier in the day, just after 3 p.m., Clallam scheduled arrival time. The Alaska Steamship Company's Victoria agent, Edward E. Blackwood, made his way to Clover Point to search for the missing ship. He soon spotted the Clallam just a few miles away, rolling heavily in the waves, clearly in distress. He called everyone he could, searching for a vessel large enough to tow the damaged ship to Victoria, and hours later, at 6 p.m., 2 large tugs, the Richard Holyoke and the Sea Lion, were dispatched from Port Townsend. The Richard Holyoke was the first to arrive on the scene at around 9:30 p.m., to the great relief of the exhausted men still desperately bailing water from the Clallam. For some reason, rather than alerting the tug to the severity of the situation and prioritizing the rescue of the men still on board, Captain Roberts instead ordered a tow line established. With the Clallam soon in tow, the men on board returned to bailing water, but the forward motion rapidly accelerated the rate of sinking. The captain was alerted to the situation and ordered everyone to the upper decks. At the same time, the Sea Lion arrived on the scene. Everyone on board the Clallam begged Roberts to hail the tug and have her rescue the men from the almost completely submerged ship. Instead, Captain Roberts asked the Sea Lion to steam to the Holyoke and asked him to drop the tow line. As the Sea Lion steamed ahead, it was now clear that the Clallam was only moments away from foundering. The tow line was cut to keep her from dragging down the Holyoke, and the vessel soon keeled onto her side, with the men on board still clinging to her railing. First Officer George Donnie, Harold Jensen, and a few other passengers desperately worked to cut a life raft free from the hurricane deck. As the Clallam went under, about a dozen men climbed onto the tiny raft. Captain Roberts' decision to send the Sea Lion away proved costly, sending everyone left on board into the water, where several would drown. Nearly half an hour later, the Sea Lion was able to circle back and retrieve survivors, including Captain Roberts. Some passengers survived by clinging to the pilot house, which broke free from the ship as she sank and now floated on the surface. According to the pocket watches of the victims who made it until the final moments, the Clallam went under at around 1:20 a.m. on January 4, 1904, meaning the whole ordeal lasted nearly 12 hours. The 3 lifeboats that killed every woman and child were launched nearly 10 hours before she sank. Later inquiries determined that the 8-inch porthole was not large enough to bring down the ship, and they suspected that her circulating pump was set incorrectly. Instead of removing water from the ship, it allowed water to enter through her open seacocks. Because of this, blame for the disaster largely fell on Chief Engineer Delaney, and his license was revoked due to gross negligence. Captain Roberts was also faulted for his behavior after his ship fell into distress. He was suspended for a year, but he was so impacted by the tragedy that he never sailed again, and he would die 11 years later. Bodies from the disaster were recovered all over the surrounding area, with many washing ashore on Vancouver Island. Deli Solons was found floating in the water, but the bodies of her 3 children were never recovered. Socialite Louise Harris was found in the bottom of a lifeboat, still clinging to the craft that took her life. Of the 90 or so people on board, approximately 56 died, though these numbers could be higher due to the spotty record keeping and the tendency to leave younger children off the manifest. The tragedy, while not the deadliest in the area, had a lasting impact. The disastrous decision to prematurely evacuate passengers, sending them into violent stormy waters without trained crew members, became a cautionary tale for many, and it's likely what kept the captain of the Princess Sophia from ordering an evacuation, ultimately dooming everyone on board. We study disasters to learn what went wrong and prevent those mistakes from happening again in the future. But what happens when we learn the wrong lesson? Sometimes the greatest mistakes are made when we think we're being cautious. If the Clallam disaster never happened, it's possible that future disasters like the Princess Sophia would not have claimed nearly as many lives. They would have made it back home, and they would have gone on to leave their mark on the world. One of the hardest decisions a captain might ever have to make is whether or not to order an evacuation of their ship. In 1904, after the SS Clallam began taking on water in a heavy storm in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Captain George Roberts panicked and hastily ordered an evacuation. 3 of his ship's lifeboats were hastily loaded and lowered into the violent sea. Within minutes, all 3 boats capsized, spilling everyone into the water. The ordeal killed nearly everyone in the boats, including every woman and child on board. The Clallam proved more seaworthy than originally thought, remaining afloat for hours, long enough for most of those still on board to be rescued, including Captain Roberts. The tragedy became a cautionary tale of what could happen if a captain reacted to an emergency in haste and sends his passengers away too quickly. This lesson would prove deadly for the SS Princess Sophia a little over a decade later. In 1891, the Canadian Pacific Railway began building a fleet of Pacific steamships connecting Vancouver, British Columbia with Asia and Australia. To further cement their market dominance, the company established a steamship line on the west coast of Canada and Alaska, running along what's known as the Inside Passage. Navigation in the area was challenging, and Canadian Pacific almost immediately lost one of their first liners on the route, called the Islander, when the 1,500-ton vessel struck an iceberg off Douglas Island in Alaska and sank within 20 minutes, killing over 40 people. To better match the rough conditions and gain an edge in the competitive market, the line began modernizing its West Coast fleet in 1907 and ordered 9 new vessels over the years leading up to the outbreak of World War I. These included the new coastal liner SS Princess Sophia. While these vessels were designed to withstand harsh weather conditions if needed, coastal liners were designed to sail within 50 miles of land. She was constructed by Bow McLaughlin and Company in Paisley, Scotland. The 2,320-ton vessel was designed to hold up to the harsh Pacific Northwest weather, and she was equipped with many modern safety features, including a double hull and a wireless communication set. She carried 8 steel lifeboats, 1 wooden workboat, and 6 life rafts. She was also equipped with 548 life preservers, 20 of which were child-sized. Her accommodations were comfortable and included a forward observation lounge, a social hall, and a 112-seat dining saloon with large windows. She had a single triple expansion steam engine that could achieve a respectable 14-knot service speed. She was designed to service the more northern British Columbia and Alaska routes in the summer and the Victoria-Vancouver routes during the winter freeze. The Princess Sophia was launched on November 8, 1911, and after she was completed in 1912, she sailed the long voyage around Cape Horn to her new home in British Columbia. On June 7, 1912, she sailed her maiden voyage and soon took up her regular route between Victoria and Skagway, Alaska, along with her running mate, the Princess May. At the outset of World War I, the Princess Sophia was requisitioned to serve the war effort. She carried some of the first troops from Western Canada to the war in Europe. Though she wouldn't survive the war, she would soon return to passenger service. By 1918, Princess Sophia was commanded by Captain Leonard P. Locke, a 66-year-old veteran of the sea who began his career at the age of 16. Captain Locke was considered one of the most experienced navigators on the West Coast at the time. Though he was known as a strict captain who ran a tight ship, he also had a softer side and enjoyed reading and writing poetry. He was particularly fond of the poet Robert W. Service. As the season came to a close, the captains of the Canadian Pacific Navigation Company were under immense pressure. On October 13th, one of the larger vessels in the Princess fleet, the Princess Adelaide, ran aground between Victoria and Vancouver. No one was injured in the accident, but the vessel was pulled from service for extensive repairs, leaving the remaining fleet with no alternate passenger vessels to fill in if there were any additional disruptions in service. Captain Locke was explicitly warned to keep his vessel out of trouble that winter, and he likely felt pressure to keep his liner on schedule. On Saturday, October 19, 1918, the Princess Sophia left Vancouver on her last northern run of the year. When she docked at Prince Rupert, steward Joseph Woosnan became ill with influenza and had to leave the ship. He was admitted to the hospital and recovered just a few days later. The Spanish flu ironically saved the young steward's life. The Princess Sophia arrived in Juneau late on October 22nd and reached her northernmost destination in Skagway the following afternoon. Winter was already setting in, and the Sophia was one of the final opportunities to leave the northern city before the freeze set in. People crowded the docks, eager to head south. She was scheduled to leave at 7 p.m., but the loading of passengers and freight took longer than expected, and she wasn't able to leave until just after 10 p.m. on October 23rd. She carried 75 crew and 278 passengers. They represented a cross-section of humanity. Oscar Poppert and his twin brother Walter were hoping to strike gold in the Alaskan interior. The two saved up enough money to head south for the winter. Walter booked passage on the Prince Rupert, but Oscar managed to get a first-class ticket on the Princess Sophia. The two parted at Skagway, planning to reunite at the Diller Hotel in Seattle. Florence Beaton's husband struck gold in the Iditarod district of Alaska. She was the first European woman to arrive there in 1909. Now she was traveling south with her 2 children, while her husband stayed behind to tend to his claim. Lulu Mae Johnson was a dance hall performer and hotelier in Dawson City, Yukon. She married her employer, Murray S. Eads, in 1904, and in 1918, the couple sold their business and were heading south to start their next venture. The gold rush was long over by this time, and the economy it fueled was winding down. Many of the Sophia's passengers were leaving the area in search of opportunities elsewhere, with no plans to return in the spring. In 1900, Skagway's population was just over 3,000 people, but by 1918, the town's population shrank to just around 500. Just about everyone in the area knew someone on board the Sophia. As she sailed away, many well-wishers crowded the wharf to see her off, one of their last links to the outside world before the harsh Alaska winter descended. As the Sophia steamed south on the main channel, conditions rapidly deteriorated. With the poor visibility, Captain Locke depended on a method of navigation called dead reckoning. This imperfect method typically used a device towed behind the ship that would measure the distance traveled from a fixed point to calculate the ship's position. While this practice was common at the time, it required precise calculations, and it was difficult to account for weather conditions and currents. While what exactly took place in her wheelhouse is unknown, it seems that despite the reduced visibility, Captain Locke kept her sailing at or near her full speed, eager to arrive in Vancouver on time. At some point, either he or his first officer Jerry Shaw made a navigation error as they traversed the Lynn Channel. In the blinding snowstorm and the heavy seas, the Princess Sophia was now sailing up to 1.25 miles off course, putting her in a direct collision course with the submerged rocks of Vanderbilt Reef. At low tide, the flat, rocky surface of Vanderbilt Reef rises only about 12 feet or 3.7 meters above the water. But at high tide and in heavy seas, the rocks sit dangerously just below the surface, almost completely invisible. At the time, these hazards were marked only by a single unlit buoy anchored at the south end of the rocks. While the channel was about 6.5 miles wide, the rocks narrowed the main navigation channel to just 2.5 miles on the east side. Unaware that they were sailing dangerously off course, the Sophia plowed forward through the night. With almost no visibility, it came as a complete surprise when at 2:10 a.m., the ship slammed violently into the hidden rocks of the reef. She struck with such force that many of her passengers were thrown from their berths. In the moments immediately after the collision, panic descended over the ship. Everyone dressed as quickly as they could, donned their life preservers, and rushed on deck. Captain Locke ordered the lifeboats readied and swung out over the side in preparation, but the order to abandon the stricken liner never came. As the experienced captain surveyed the situation, it was abundantly clear to him that in the violent storm, no one would survive in the tiny lifeboats. Almost immediately, 20-year-old wireless operator David M. Robinson began sending out distress signals. His messages soon reached Juneau and were passed on to CPR agent Frank Lowell, who immediately began contacting captains in the area. Within an hour, the first rescue craft, a 65-foot gasoline launch, the Estebeth, captained by James P. Davis, left Juneau for the scene of the stranded liner. She would be the first of many. As Captain Locke assessed his ship, the severity of the situation was clear. While the Princess Sophia was not taking on any water, she was lodged firmly on the rocks with little hope of backing off at high tide. The initial panic had long subsided, and by mid-morning when the tide receded, the ship's bottom was lodged around 9 feet above the surface of the water. The Estebeth arrived on the scene at around 11 a.m. By this time, the storm was settling. The snow had stopped, and while the seas were still heavy, they were not so heavy that lifeboats couldn't survive. Captain Davis was even able to row his ship's workboat to within 50 feet of the Princess Sophia. He hailed Captain Locke and asked him if he was going to order an evacuation. Captain Davis would later testify that he felt that while the vessel's position would have made it difficult to lower lifeboats and load them from the reef, it would have been possible with some muscle power from the crew and more able-bodied passengers. Another small vessel of similar size to the Estebeth, the Amy, soon arrived on the scene. Her captain, Edward McDougall, also asked Captain Locke whether he was ready to begin evacuating his passengers. Despite aid from the two vessels, who were able to get relatively close to the stricken liner in calmer weather conditions, Captain Locke refused to allow his passengers to evacuate. He determined that the Sophia was lodged firmly in a crevice on the rocks and that they were in no immediate danger. As the day dragged on, other small vessels arrived on the scene to offer assistance, but by late afternoon the weather once again soon deteriorated, and Captain Locke encouraged the smaller vessels to seek safe anchorage for the night. Complicating the situation, cable communications to Alaska were lost only a few days before. While they had been restored, a rush of messages were making it difficult to organize rescue efforts. Because of this, the 1,341-ton lighthouse tender Cedar did not receive word of the situation until 3 p.m. on the 24th. Commanded by Captain John W. Ledbetter, the Cedar was performing patrol duties for the United States Navy. Being only 66 nautical miles from the scene, she was the largest all-weather vessel in the area. Captain Ledbetter sent a wireless message to Captain Locke to offer assistance. Locke immediately accepted. As the Cedar headed for the stricken liner, Ledbetter asked Locke if it would be possible to evacuate his passengers in the night. Locke responded, "Impossible to get passengers off tonight. Sea running too strong. May get off tomorrow. Strong tide." By the evening, as larger fishing vessels arrived on the scene, the weather grew significantly worse, with strong winds and heavy seas. One of these vessels, the King of Winge, was able to get within 900 feet of the Sophia, but they lacked a wireless set and were unable to make contact with Captain Locke. They could see people moving around the decks of the grounded ship, but with the storm raging, there was little they could do to help. The Cedar arrived on the scene just after 8 p.m., but by this point the storm left them incapable of mounting any rescue effort. Had contact been made with the Cedar earlier in the day, she might have been able to reach the Sophia during those precious few hours of calm when a rescue might have been possible. Now, they had little option but to hope for better conditions in the morning. Snow soon began to fall once again, creating near blizzard conditions. The small flotilla of rescue vessels were forced to seek shelter for the night, leaving the Princess Sophia to fend for herself through the storm. The night of the 24th was a cold and uncomfortable ordeal for the Princess Sophia's unlucky passengers and crew. At 8:30 p.m., one of the boiler's main pipes ruptured, causing the ship's heat and lighting to fail. Some rescue ships on the scene even thought she had been lost when her lights disappeared. It's hard to imagine just what that night would have been like. Without heating, her passenger spaces would be bitterly cold as the snow and wind battered the stricken liner. Those on board probably huddled in their bunks, listening to the howling wind and their steel-hulled trap groaning on the rocks. By this point, they would have been trapped for a full day, and the horrifying ordeal was far from over. Power on the ship was finally restored at 11 a.m. on October 25th, offering the passengers a brief reprieve from the bitter cold and affording wireless operator David Robinson another opportunity to contact the outside world. But the morning offered little reprieve from the harsh conditions. Captain Locke felt that his liner had held up well through the night, and he felt no reason to believe his passengers were in any immediate danger. While the storm raged on, Captain Ledbetter desperately searched for a way to mount a rescue. In the night, he tried to assess the situation with searchlights, and determined that it would be impossible to evacuate by lifeboat. His next idea was to get the Cedar as close to the Princess Sophia as possible and establish a breacher's buoy. This was a desperate solution, with little hope of successfully rescuing the over 300 people trapped on board. After 2 failed attempts to drop anchor, Captain Locke radioed Ledbetter, telling him that it was no use and they would need to wait for conditions to improve at low tide. The Cedar soon departed the scene to retrieve a longer anchor chain. Throughout the morning, Robinson kept contact with the Cedar's wireless operator Elwood Miller. The 2 men were exhausted, Miller working for more than 24 hours at this point, relaying messages, organizing the rescue effort. They lost contact when the Sophia's power again failed at around 2 p.m., and they agreed to contact each other again at 4 p.m. Elwood took the opportunity to finally get some rest, sleeping with his headset on in case his counterpart tried to contact him. 4 p.m. passed without a message from Robinson. Miller assumed Robinson was still resting. Just after sunset, at 4:50 p.m., his headset crackled with a frantic SOS from Robinson. "Ship foundering on reef. Come at once." Miller replied that the Cedar was speeding to their rescue. Robinson's signal was so weak that it could hardly be heard. He radioed another desperate message. "For God's sake, hurry. Water is coming into my room." Miller replied, "We are coming. Save your batteries." Robinson, "All right, but keep talking to me so we will know you are coming." That was the last message received from the Princess Sophia at 5:20 p.m. on October 25th. The Cedar desperately searched the area, but the stranded liner was nowhere to be found in the stormy darkness. What exactly happened in the Sophia's final moments is unknown, but it's clear that she came to a quick and violent end. Watches recovered from her victims all stopped at 5:50 p.m., marking the time they were thrown into the sea. Not a single person on board the Princess Sophia survived. The only survivor was an English setter found in Auk Bay outside Juneau. It's believed that as the tide rose, the ship became partially buoyant, causing her to violently shift over the rocks in the heavy surf, ripping open her hull before washing her into the sea, where she quickly foundered. But many mysteries remain. Robinson's first SOS message was received almost a full hour before the watches on her victims stopped. While most of her passengers had time to don life preservers, the bodies of over 100 victims were found still in their cabin. All 8 of her steel-hulled lifeboats went down with the ship. In the icy water, victims would survive only minutes before succumbing to hypothermia. The next day, the storm died down considerably as the Cedar and other rescue vessels combed the area. When they reached the site, they found only her foremast sticking out of the water. The Princess Sophia was the deadliest maritime accident in the history of British Columbia and Alaska. With no survivors and larger world events to focus on, the Princess Sophia and her victims soon faded from memory. The little we know of what happened on board during those final hours came from her wireless messages and letters found on the bodies of her victims. We have no way of knowing what was passing through Captain Locke's mind during those critical hours after his vessel grounded. It can be assumed that he was well aware that the decision to evacuate could put his passengers in even more danger. He had no way of knowing that those few early hours of calm weather were the best window of opportunity he would ever get. And while it was possible in those hours to mount an evacuation, the steel lifeboats weighed more than a ton each and would have to be lifted off the rocks and into the water, an incredibly difficult and dangerous task. Another potential explanation for his decision came from Captain Ledbetter, who reported a rising barometer. Captain Locke surely would have been monitoring his own barometer and likely assumed that the weather would soon improve. As he looked out at the waves crashing violently on the rocks below, his mind no doubt went to the Clallam disaster, with lifeboats crashing into the sea, hurling helpless women and children to their deaths. His hope and confidence in his ship told him salvation was only moments away. Unfortunately, he was wrong, sealing the fate of everyone on board. In the days before modern navigation equipment, a ship lost in a fog bank was essentially sailing blind, with little more to rely on than a captain's skill. Dead reckoning, an imperfect method of navigation that measured how far a ship has traveled from a fixed point, often led vessels miles off course, and could do nothing to anticipate what lay hidden in the fog. To avoid a potentially deadly collision, ships relied on their foghorns, blown at regular intervals at all hours to warn nearby ship traffic. During the summer months from June to October, dense fog banks are a common occurrence along the Pacific coastline of the United States and caused numerous shipwrecks at the beginning of the 20th century. Fierce competition between the steamship companies that operated between the major cities of California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska put enormous pressure on steamship captains. Many of these companies were operated by railroads, which were accustomed to maintaining a strict schedule no matter the conditions. But these customs were poorly suited for the treacherous and unpredictable waters of the wild Pacific Ocean. When the swirling mist of a looming fog bank rolled in, captains often maintained a high speed, their foghorns blaring, hoping that no danger loomed in the fog. On December 31st, 1879, in Menlo Park, New Jersey, Thomas Edison unveiled his most famous invention, the carbon filament light bulb. While others had already stumbled on this invention, Edison's New Year's Eve display of his incandescent light bulb was the first to capture the public's imagination. He famously proclaimed that he will make electricity so cheap that only the rich will burn candles. One of those attending this event was Henry Villard, the president of the Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company. Like pretty much everyone else, Villard thought this newfangled electric light was pretty darn cool, and he immediately requested that Edison install his electric lighting system on his company's newest steamer, the SS Columbia. That same year, the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company bought and merged with the Oregon Steamship Company, greatly expanding their steamship routes. To operate these new routes, a state-of-the-art steamship was ordered in July 1879. Labeled Hull Number 193, this new steamship was constructed at the John Roach & Sons Delaware River Iron Shipbuilding and Engine Works Shipyard in Chester, Pennsylvania. Construction began in September 1879, and the ship was launched on February 24, 1880. Not trusting the new electrical equipment, John Roach refused to install the incandescent lighting system at his shipyard, fearing that it could spark a fire. So in spring of 1880, the Columbia was sailed to New York City, where Edison and his team installed the system themselves. The lights were lit on May 2, 1880, the first commercial installation of Edison's new light bulb. The Columbia's owners were clearly interested in equipping their new steamship with the latest comforts and technology. She measured 309 feet in length with a beam of 38.5 feet and came in at 2,721 tons. She was equipped with 4 decks and powered by 6 coal-burning boilers that fed 2 compound condensing steam engines to power a single 16-foot diameter Hirsch 4-bladed propeller, achieving a 16-knot service speed, which was respectable for the time. A second auxiliary steam engine powered her electric lights. She was also equipped with a brigantine rig sail plan that could be rigged upon 2 iron masts. This was just before steam power was trusted enough to forego sails altogether. She could carry 382 passengers between her first class and steerage. Designed to service the San Francisco to Portland route, she was equipped with several safety features. She carried 8 metal lifeboats, 1 wooden lifeboat, and a wooden workboat, along with 5 life rafts and 537 life preservers. The Columbia sailed around Cape Horn to San Francisco in the summer of 1880, carrying a shipment of 13 locomotives and 200 railroad cars. Once in San Francisco, her original carbon paper filament bulbs were replaced by newer bulbs with bamboo filaments. Columbia's engineer sent a letter of satisfaction with the system to Edison, reporting that none of the lights gave out after 415 hours and 45 minutes of constant use. She arrived in Portland for the first time on August 28. Her electric lights were a great success, and soon other shipping companies had similar systems installed in their vessels, with Cunard's SS Sophia being the first major transatlantic ocean liner fitted with incandescent light bulbs. The Columbia's owners and the traveling public were delighted with her as she set out on a long and celebrated career. At the turn of the century, the Union Pacific Railroad took over the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company, and in 1904, the subsidiary changed its name to the San Francisco and Portland Steamship Company. For over 2 decades, the Columbia served her passengers and company well, and carried a solid reputation for reliability. In July 1895, her original Edison generators were replaced by a more modern system, and her original dynamos were donated to the Smithsonian. By the early years of the 20th century, the iron-hulled Columbia was now outclassed by a new generation of steam vessels, but her owners still had faith in the old vessel, and she was regularly maintained and refitted. On April 18, 1906, while the Columbia was dry docked at the Union Iron Works in San Francisco for a refit, the city was devastated by a massive earthquake. The violent shaking knocked the Columbia off her supports, and she rolled onto her side, puncturing her plates in 9 places and partially flooding her hull. Despite the damage, her owners were not ready to retire the old steamship, and over the course of 2 months, the holes were patched and the water was pumped out. She was then transported to the dock at Hunter's Point, where more extensive repairs could be made. She was nearly lost during transport when she encountered heavy seas. Her steam pipes burst and the crippled ship developed a heavy list. Thinking she was only moments away from an explosion, her crew hastily abandoned her. But she was soon recovered and towed to the dry dock, where she underwent extensive repairs. She was soon returned to service in January of 1907. Aside from briefly getting stuck in pack ice on the Columbia River, the steamship Columbia finally resumed operating her regular route between San Francisco and Portland. While she was well past her prime, she continued to serve reliably, but her long and storied career would soon come to a sudden and violent end. As the sun rose over San Francisco on the morning of Saturday, July 20th, 1907, the city found itself shrouded in a dense fog. If you're familiar with San Francisco, you know that this is typical weather for the city. For the 27-year-old SS Columbia, the fog was nothing more than an annoying inconvenience as she prepared for another routine voyage to Portland. But it was dense enough that it delayed her 11 a.m. sailing, giving a handful of late-arriving passengers a chance to board the ship. The convention for the National Education Association recently wrapped up in Los Angeles, and many of the Columbia's passengers were schoolteachers. Lulu Hansen, a young teacher from Minneapolis, was touring the West Coast on her way home, as was Emma Grice, another teacher from Cleveland. Other passengers came from all walks of life. Ottilia Lydell taught music in San Francisco. She was traveling to Portland for vacation. Stella Cannon, her brother Louis, and their elderly mother were on their way to visit Stella's older brother. Maybelle Watson was the 16-year-old daughter of a prominent family in Berkeley, California. She was heading to Portland to visit her brother. 20-year-old William J. Smith, the son of an army contractor, was returning home to Vancouver, Washington, after visiting some friends in San Francisco. On this voyage, the Columbia carried 251 passengers and crew. She was commanded by Captain Peter Doran. The fog over San Francisco soon broke to reveal a pleasant summer day. The Columbia left about an hour after her scheduled departure time and sailed north for the mouth of the Columbia River in Oregon. Several passengers, including Lulu Hansen, spent the first few hours of the voyage on deck, enjoying the beautiful weather and the scenery of the California coast. But as the Columbia steamed past Point Reyes, a swell gradually developed. As the ship rocked from side to side, Lulu and many other passengers began to experience seasickness, and many retired to their cabins early. As the sun set, a heavy fog bank soon enveloped the ship. Captain Doran, who had recently retired to his cabin for the evening, returned on bridge to guide his vessel. While these conditions were difficult, they were typical for the Northern California coast, and Captain Doran maintained the Columbia's high speed, eager to make up for the time lost from their delayed departure. He was joined on bridge by Quartermaster J. Ellis and Second Officer Richard Agarup. Just past midnight, approximately 12 miles off Shelter Cove, lookout S.G. Peterson stood tense at a station as he peered into the darkness. The fog was so thick that he could only see approximately 2 ship lengths ahead of them. As was customary for these conditions, the Columbia sounded her fog whistle at regular intervals as she sailed blindly through the night. Not long into his watch, right after the Columbia's fog whistle cut through the night, Peterson thought he heard the whistle of another ship answer back. Soon Captain Doran and Second Officer Agarup also heard the whistle, but the captain did not order his engine room to reduce their speed. Over the next 15 minutes, the Columbia continued on, with the whistle of the mystery ship ringing out every 60 seconds, growing louder with each blast. Still, Captain Doran maintained his speed. Then Agarup spotted the lights of another ship about 2 points off their starboard bow. Captain Doran ordered 2 blasts from their whistle to signal their passing, but it was too late. The oncoming ship let out 1 whistle, followed by several short blasts, the signal for imminent danger. At 5 o'clock on Saturday, July 20th, 1907, the 457-ton steam schooner San Pedro departed Eureka, California, loaded with 390,000 feet of redwood, destined for San Pedro, California. At midnight, First Officer Ben Hendrickson took charge as they sailed south through the heavy fog. Like Captain Doran, Hendrickson also chose not to reduce their speed despite the low visibility. At around 12:15 a.m., Lookout E. Soderberg shouted that he heard a faint fog whistle off their port bow. While Hendrickson didn't hear the whistle himself, he ordered a change in course, taking them further out to sea to avoid the passing traffic. He never ordered the ship to slow down as the minutes passed and the whistle of the other ship answered their own, louder and louder, until suddenly, the mast of the Columbia appeared from the fog off their port bow, nearly on top of them. Hendrickson ordered his engines stopped and let out a warning signal. At the same time, Captain Doran ordered the Columbia's engines reversed in a desperate ploy to avoid collision, but it was too late. The bow of the San Pedro slammed into the Columbia at 12:22 a.m. Doran shouted from his bridge at the San Pedro, "What are you doing, man?" as its engines reversed, pulling the two ships apart. The San Pedro was badly damaged. Roused by the impact, Captain Magnus Hansen climbed forward just in time to see the gaping hole in the Columbia's side as the two ships separated. At about 6 yards apart, the Columbia disappeared in the fog. It seemed that despite the damage, the San Pedro would just barely remain afloat, aided by the buoyant lumber in her cargo holds. Captain Hansen ordered his 3 small lifeboats lowered to pick up survivors, because it was immediately clear that the large passenger liner was doomed. On the Columbia, Captain Doran ordered Second Officer Agrup to prepare the lifeboats while he went forward to inspect the damage. Earlier that evening, passenger William Smith spent most of the night visiting Chief Engineer John F. Jackson in his cabin. He recalled that the night was especially cold and dark. As he returned to his cabin at around midnight, he could see nothing but the swirling fog in the soft glow of the ship's lights. Only moments after he began preparing for bed, he heard the exchange of fog whistles and realized something terrible was happening. He ran on deck just in time to see the San Pedro collide with the ship and then disappear into the fog. The collision felt to him like a long, soft grind, hardly enough to wake most of the sleeping passengers. Immediately realizing the severity of the situation, Smith ran back to the passenger cabins. He ran up and down the hall, pounding and kicking on doors, desperately trying to rouse the sleeping passengers who had only minutes to escape the now sinking ship. Ottilia Lydell, whose cabin was closer to the collision, had trouble sleeping due to her seasickness. She described a much more violent collision that immediately got her out of bed, certain that what she felt was a critical death blow to the ship. Chief Engineer Jackson, who just bid goodnight to Smith, was laying in his berth at the time, just dozing off when he felt the dull shock. He dressed quickly and raced to the engine room to assess the situation. He found the room dry, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He warned First Assistant Engineer M.C. Burpee, who was on watch at the time, not to let himself or the other crew get caught below. Jackson then raced up to the bridge to find out how bad the situation was, but as he reached the hurricane deck, he heard the stern voice of the captain ordering everyone to the boats. When Ottilia reached the deck, she found nothing but confusion, as no one seemed to know what to do. There was a strange but brief moment of calm immediately after the collision that lulled some into a false sense of security. A few tried to return to their staterooms, but they were stopped by the crew. Then, the vessel suddenly lurched considerably to starboard, igniting panic for the passengers still below deck, only just waking up, many of them still seasick. In the confusion, several passengers searched desperately for their life preservers, which were stowed in their cabins. William Smith did his best to help other passengers put these on. He recalled one family, a mother, father, and their 3 small children. After helping them get their life preservers on, William left to help others. He last saw them holding hands in their cabin. He learned later that the entire family was lost. As Lulu Hansen reached the top deck, she found a scene of utter chaos. She saw the captain doing his best to calm passengers, telling them to follow orders and they would be safe. Lulu recalled that he was the only cool-headed person on the ship. Once the order was given to head to the boats, Chief Engineer Jackson returned to his cabin to grab his life preserver, but he found that it was gone. Someone else must have already taken it. He then raced to the engine room, now rapidly filling with water. He called down into the darkness, but received no reply. With nothing left to do, he headed to his assigned lifeboat, number 4. By now, the Columbia was turning over so quickly that Jackson had to cut the small boat from the falls, and it was able to float free without lowering. Otelia found herself at the Columbia's stern, with the ship sinking so fast by the bow that only 7 minutes after hearing the collision, she was now perched high above the waves on the ship, only moments away from its final plunge. In a major stroke of luck, Otelia saw one of the ship's life rafts floating empty right below her. She instinctively jumped down, injuring her hip but landing safely in the raft. Another woman who followed her wasn't so lucky, and Otelia watched as she jumped and quickly disappeared in the black water. Soon others were able to climb into the raft, which drifted near the Columbia's bridge, now quickly submerging. From their vantage point, they could see Captain Doran, still at his station, bracing himself at the rail, blasting the ship's whistle. As he was taken by the waves, he extended both hands and appeared to say goodbye. The ship's ringing whistle seemed to die with him. In the pandemonium, Stella Cannon, her brother Lewis, and their mother had only moments to react to the collision. Almost as soon as they secured their life preservers and made their way on deck, the ship's final plunge was already beginning. Already exhausted, Stella's elderly mother sat on a bench at the stern. The family was separated as the ship dropped from beneath them and seemed to explode just beneath the water. Some thought that this was a boiler explosion, but it was more likely caused by collapsing air pockets deep within the ship. The violent blast fractured Stella's thumb and 2 ribs, but she was soon picked up by Chief Engineer Jackson's lifeboat. She could hear her brother's screams in the darkness and begged Jackson to row in his direction, but Jackson refused, fearing that the debris, still shooting up from the wreck, would damage and sink the already overloaded lifeboat. Fortunately, Lewis was picked up by another boat, but their mother was lost. As the ship dropped, Lulu Hansen desperately searched for a boat, but she could only find one that was still covered and lashed to the deck. Almost in an instant, she was thrown into the sea as the Columbia lurched to starboard. Fortunately, wearing a life preserver, Lulu was soon picked up by 3rd Officer House's boat. William Smith also found himself thrown into the frigid water. In the chaos, he saw the San Pedro's mast light just barely visible in the darkness. He instinctively swam for the light, almost impossibly far away. Somehow, he reached the safety of the other ship, fortunate that he was a strong swimmer. The San Pedro also picked up Otelia's raft and several others. The small ship's deck was now barely above the waterline. Mabel Watson was able to find a place in a crowded lifeboat, one of only a few actually launched from the starboard side of the ship. But overloaded, the small craft was unable to clear the Columbia before she was sucked under. Mabel was pulled to the surface by her life preserver. She found herself surrounded by other people in the water. Then, she saw another young woman, schoolteacher Emma Grice, struggling and shouting for help. Emma's life preserver was strapped on backwards, forcing her head into the water. Mabel immediately swam over to Emma and used every ounce of strength she had to help keep her head above the water, likely saving her life. The 2 women were soon picked up by 3rd Officer House's lifeboat. Despite other people nearby, 16-year-old Mabel was the only one who was willing to help Emma, and she was rightfully hailed as a hero following the disaster. Soon other ships arrived on the scene to rescue survivors and relieve the San Pedro, which now refused to take on anyone else, fearing that they were only moments away from foundering. Following the collision, the Columbia dropped like a stone, sinking in just 8 or 9 minutes. Of the 251 passengers and crew on board, 88 lost their lives. Coming on the heels of the high-profile sinkings of the city of Rio de Janeiro, the Clallam, and the Valencia, the public was demanding answers. Like so many other disasters, the Columbia tragedy came with a series of random decisions and coincidences that would soon prove fateful. When Rose Anderson, a restaurant worker who was headed to Seattle via Portland, arrived at the wharf, she exchanged her ticket at the last minute with a young schoolteacher who couldn't get a ticket in time for the Columbia. Rose thought little of it, since she was in less of a hurry than the schoolteacher. She never caught the young woman's name, and never knew if she survived the sinking. Rowena and Ruby Cooper were schoolteachers from Fayette, Missouri, touring the Pacific coast. Ruby was afraid of trains, so the two decided to take the Columbia to Portland instead. When the ship sank, Ruby survived, but her sister Rowena drowned. Ruby later told a reporter that she would have rather sunk with her sister. Assistant engineer Al Robertson learned just before the Columbia's final voyage that he was accepted to join the San Francisco Fire Department. At the last minute, he exchanged his position on the ship with another young man named Max Klaus. Max would lose his life in the sinking. It seems that those in the engine room failed to heed Chief Engineer Jackson's warning and stayed below too long. As Grace and Effie Keller of Decatur, Illinois rushed to the Spear Street Wharf to catch the Columbia, they were sure that they'd missed her, arriving a few minutes past her 11 a.m. departure time. They were meeting their mother, G.A. Keller, and their sister Alma, who were also running late. The Columbia's delayed departure felt like a stroke of luck. But all 4 women died in the tragedy. With so many wrecked passenger ships, public outrage at the steamship companies in the area was reaching a fever pitch. No one could understand how the Columbia could sink so rapidly. While she was old, she was known to be reliable. She was equipped with 4 watertight compartments and had just passed a routine inspection a few months prior, certifying that she met all safety regulations at the time. Investigators determined that the Columbia's iron hull had grown brittle with age and cracked after bearing the full brunt of the collision, creating a 7-foot gash. While she had 4 watertight compartments, much like the Titanic, they did not extend the full height of her hull. This helps explain why the ship initially seemed sound. At first, the flooding impacted only one compartment, but once it spilled over into the next, it took the old ship down almost in an instant. Captain Doran and First Officer Hendrickson of the San Pedro were found to bear most of the responsibility for the accident. But Captain Doran's decisive actions and cool demeanor after the collision, and his going down with his ship, left his reputation somewhat untarnished. The crew of the San Pedro faced a harsher judgment. Hendrickson's license was suspended for 5 years. It was also determined that Captain Hansen issued insufficient orders and neglected his duties by being absent from the bridge while navigating in low visibility. The survivors, however, mostly praised the crews of both ships for their actions after the collision, for doing everything they could to save as many lives as possible. The San Pedro nearly sank herself while her crew pulled survivors from the water. At just under 10 minutes, the 4th chapter of this video, describing the events of the sinking, is longer than the time it took the Columbia to go under following the collision. 8 minutes is an incredibly fast rate of sinking for a 2,721-ton ship. It's an absolute nightmare scenario. What was once a technological marvel became a death trap. If it wasn't for the heroism of the Columbia's crew and passengers like William Smith and Maybelle Watson, many more would have lost their lives. It's a lesson that when technology fails us, we're often left on our own to watch out for each other.
The coast of California. In the north, a mountainous land of lonely cliffs. Here, cold air rises from the chilled waters flowing southward from Alaska, creating seasonal dense fogs that wrap the region in mystery.
On the morning of Friday, February 22nd, 1901, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the city of San Francisco awoke to another day of dense fog. In those days, when the fog rolled in, as it so often does in the Bay Area, ships would drop anchor at the mouth of Golden Gate and wait for the fog to clear. At the Fort Point Barracks, Private Harry Taylor had drawn the early morning sentry duty. As he paced the wall perimeter of the old fort, sometime after 5:30, he thought he heard something in the darkness. He walked to the edge and listened. From somewhere deep in the fog, he heard a strained, gurgling steam whistle. It was like no other whistle he had ever heard before on the bay. As the strange whistle faded, it was replaced by a faint cacophony of screams echoing over the water. Meanwhile, at the Fort Point Life-Saving Station, lookout Mark Ellingson was situated in the station's tower, a position that placed him on an island above the fog. Just after 5:30, he too heard whistles and shouts echoing in the darkness. He could have picked up the phone and called in an alarm, but instead, he did nothing. The whistles stopped, and soon the morning was quiet again as daylight approached. At 7:20, Ellingson saw a lifeboat emerge from the clearing fog. It wasn't until that moment, 2 hours too late, that he realized that a major tragedy just occurred in the fog at Golden Gate.
The wild cries of seabirds are stilled, and the only sound is the endless bleat of the foghorns, warning ships of a rocky shore.
In the 1870s, the American industrialist John Roach owned the largest shipbuilding firm in the United States, producing more tonnage at its shipyard in Chester, Pennsylvania than the next two largest firms combined. Roach dreamed of transforming his shipyard into a vast global transportation empire, and he saw an opportunity in the Brazilian import market. At the time, trade with Brazil was dominated by British shipping companies in what was known as the Triangle Trade, that sent ships from Britain to Brazil, the United States, and then back to Britain. Hoping to break the monopoly, John Roach established the United States and Brazil Mail Steamship Company in 1876. Two steamships were commissioned to operate the new venture, the City of Para and the City of Rio de Janeiro, which was launched on March 6, 1878. Despite President Rutherford B. Hayes and many members of Congress attending the launches, both the US and Brazilian governments ultimately rejected Roach's request for subsidies. The venture quickly proved unprofitable and folded after only 2 years of operation. Roach's shipyard never recovered from the financial loss and went out of business in 1885. The City of Rio and her sister ship were soon sold to the Pacific Mail Steamship Company in 1881 and were refitted for a new career on the Pacific, traveling between San Francisco, Hawaii, Japan, and Hong Kong. The iron-hulled City of Rio was one of the larger ships in the company's fleet, coming in at 4,548 tons and measuring 370 feet or 113 meters in length, with a beam of 39 feet or 12 meters. She was driven by a single screw, powered by a compound steam engine fed by 6 boilers. She was equipped with a barkentine rig sail plan for auxiliary power. She quickly became a workhorse for the company and proved popular with passengers, but her 20 years on the Pacific weren't without incident. In 1893, Alfred Daniel Jones, the Consul General of the United States in Shanghai, booked passage on the ship to return to the US for treatment after suffering from mental health issues. Soon after the ship's departure, he became violent and had to be restrained in his cabin. He reportedly raved incessantly for 7 days before dying on board on December 9, 1893. The strangeness of this unsettling incident is compounded by the poor understanding of mental health at the time, and the sensationalized press reports that make it difficult to know what actually happened. In 1895, the ship struck a reef in Nagasaki. The damage was so severe that she had to be beached in order to prevent her from sinking completely. She was soon refloated and repaired. In 1897, she encountered a massive typhoon between Japan and Hawaii. She fought the storm for 12 days and burned through all of her coal before she could reach port. Her topmasts, deckhouses, and furniture were broken up and burned to generate enough power to complete her voyage. Again, the damage was repaired and she was returned to service. She was leased as a troop ship in 1898 during the Spanish-American War to transport troops to Manila, and carried up to 1,000 troops per voyage on what must have been some incredibly claustrophobic passages. In 1900, she was returned to passenger service and quickly collided with a ship called the Bombay in Hong Kong on August 5, 1900. Once again, she was quickly repaired and returned to service. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company often purchased their ships secondhand and frequently kept older vessels in operation for decades, opting time and again to refit and repair their aging liners rather than commission new ones. This meant that their fleet only barely met the minimum safety requirements at the time. The City of Rio was built before double bottoms and watertight compartments became a common safety feature. Her lower deck was dominated by large, uninterrupted cargo spaces, with nothing in place to stop the flooding if the ship was ever breached. This left her especially vulnerable as they navigated the unforgiving waters at the entrance of San Francisco Bay. In 1883, William Ward joined the Pacific Mail Steamship Company as an apprentice captain on the City of Rio. Born in Raleigh, North Carolina, Ward was elevated to captain in 1897. During his years in command, he quickly gained a reputation as a cautious navigator who didn't take chances with his ship. By 1901, the charismatic 38-year-old captain excelled at the social aspects of the job. He was an excellent host at the captain's table at dinner, and wealthy travelers frequently chose the Rio over other options just to enjoy his company. The city of Rio de Janeiro departed for the United States on Tuesday, January 19, 1901. She had approximately 220 passengers and crew on board. While Pacific Mail Steamship Company liners were once filled with Chinese migrants, the Chinese Exclusion Act barred nearly all Chinese immigration by 1901, and most of the Asian passengers on board were on academic or cultural scholarships. Many were just passing through the United States on their way to Europe. Steerage on board the ship was still racially divided, with white and European travelers in one section and Asian travelers in another, lower section. The most high-profile person on board was Rounseville Wildman, the U.S. Consul General in Hong Kong. He was traveling with his wife Letitia, their 2 children, and their maid to take part in the inauguration of William McKinley. The long voyage was uneventful. As they approached San Francisco Bay, they were met with a heavy bank of fog, but this was nothing out of the ordinary. The anchors were dropped to wait for the fog to clear, and at 5 p.m. on Thursday, February 21st, harbor pilot Frederick W. Jordan boarded to guide the ship into the bay. With over 24 years of experience guiding ships across the bar, Jordan never suffered a single mishap. Multiple passengers and crew later reported that Captain Ward had no interest in taking any chances, and he was prepared to wait out the fog, no matter how long it took. It was very normal in those days for ships to wait hours or even days to cross the notoriously treacherous Golden Gate. But that night at dinner at the captain's table, Kate West, a Red Cross nurse who was traveling home after taking a patient to Hong Kong, remembered both the Consul General and Mrs. Wildman expressing their frustration to the captain, telling him that the delay was greatly interfering with their plans. They were afraid that they would miss the president's inauguration. Whether the pressure from the well-connected family had any influence over the captain will never be known. What exactly happened the next morning is not entirely clear, but at 4 a.m., Second Officer Graham Coughlan called harbor pilot Jordan and Captain Ward to the bridge due to a change in the weather. Jordan had previously asked that he be called first, and as soon as he arrived on the bridge, he ordered First Officer C.J. Johnson to raise the anchors. But as soon as they were lifted out of the water, the thick fog descended once again. Jordan then left the bridge, perhaps to conference with the captain. When he returned, he gave the order to finish heaving the anchors and start the engines. Captain Ward only stepped on the bridge for the first time that morning a few minutes later, still in his night clothes. It's unclear who was in charge at that moment, the captain or the harbor pilot. But in any case, the quartermaster was given a course and the engine room was signaled to proceed at half speed. As the ship moved forward, lookout Frederick Lindstrom could see nothing but a dense wall of fog. Suddenly, he saw the flash of a red and white light just off the ship's bow. He later said, "I felt my heart stand still. I knew what was coming." The city of Rio de Janeiro slammed into the reef at the south side of the Narrows at 5:30 a.m. on Friday, February 22, 1901. The people on board, most of them still asleep, would have only minutes to escape the doomed liner. In the first moments just after the collision, few people on board realized the severity of the situation. The ship's carpenter, Frank Camp, was assisting with raising the anchors and was just finishing stowing the cables when the ship struck the rocks. After going below to assess the damage, it was clear to him that the ship would go under in only a few minutes. He raced to the bridge to report to the captain that there was already 10 feet of water in the forward hold and 20 feet amidship. The collision ripped through the starboard forward quarter of the ship's hull as far back as her boiler room. They were now perched precariously on a rocky ledge at Fort Point, giving a false initial sense of stability. But as her stern filled with water, she was in danger of slipping off the ledge into deeper water at any moment. Reports on Captain Ward's actions after the collision vary widely. One witness claimed that the captain immediately went to his cabin and locked the door. But most said that while he seemed stunned by the situation, he took an active role in the evacuation. Even after the collision, it remained unclear what orders came from Captain Ward and which came from Jordan, the harbor pilot. As soon as Camp reported the extent of the damage, the order was given to launch the lifeboats. Captain Ward let out a distress signal using the ship's whistle. He tied it down to let out a continuous blast that would last until the ship went under. There were dozens of ships and small fishing craft in the area, but with the low visibility, the blast from the whistle was critical in attracting attention to the unfolding disaster. It was clear to the passengers that something bad happened, but few realized the severity of the situation. Several were still asleep or only just waking up. Many of the survivors were those who were already awake or up top when the collision occurred. Kate West was already up and getting dressed when the liner struck. She described a terrible concussion when they hit and said it felt like the whole vessel was going to pieces. Steerage steward Harry Donahue was also awake at the time and getting dressed when he felt a heavy jar and the ship began to tremble beneath his feet. Others, like freight clerk George Englehart, felt only a dull thud. He figured that they must have hit something, but he didn't think it was a cause for concern. Still, he awoke the purser who was berthed next door and then proceeded to dress in his full uniform, without any rush. First-class passenger William Brandon Jr. was also asleep in his cabin, but he was awoken by the collision. Startled by the violent jolt, he raced topside, still in his nightclothes, but a crew member told him that they had just grounded and that it was nothing serious. This reflected the lack of a unified response to the emergency by the ship's crew. The later inquiry would reveal that lifeboat drills were rare and not taken seriously. Almost no crew member reported ever practicing preparing or lowering the lifeboats before that morning. To save money, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company would hire Chinese workers for low-skill positions on the ship. Because of this, most of the ship's seamen did not speak any English, and a single bilingual bosun was used to translate orders. In the confusion, this made it almost impossible to quickly issue orders to the crew. Anti-Asian sentiments at the time were incredibly strong. After the disaster, the Chinese crew members were unfairly blamed for the high loss of life. It's clear that language barriers added to the confusion on board, but Second Officer Graham Coughlan later testified that once the orders were understood, the Chinese crew obeyed them with promptness and courage. The general lack of training and preparedness from the crew as a whole was certainly not the fault of a handful of low-wage deckhands. The initial moments of calm didn't last long. After only a few moments, the ship's electric lights cut out. In the darkness, the ship descended into a confused panic as the ship lost stability, and the people on board realized that they only had a few moments left to escape. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Arthur A. O'Neill, slept through the collision entirely. He was charged with lifeboat number 9, which was designated for the Consul General and his family. After he was awoken by a quartermaster, he quickly dressed and was met by Jordan, who ordered him to launch the lifeboat. Dr. O'Neill, a quartermaster, and a few deckhands began launching the boat, but it quickly slipped on the falls, sending the stern crashing into the water. First-class passenger Zenji Yamada, a Japanese painter who was on his way to study in New York, had just gone up to see the ship enter the harbor when she struck the rocks. When the lights went out, he found himself overwhelmed by the confusion on board. He tried to go below deck, but was pushed back up by the panicking crowds. Seamstress Frances Ripley was traveling in steerage with her father. While he slept, she went on deck to watch the ship pass through Golden Gate. As the ship descended into chaos, she managed to remain calm. It occurred to her that some of the women still below might need help. In the confusion, she found nurse Kate West, who she described as bewildered and frightened. Thinking fast, Ripley grabbed West and pushed her up on deck. Realizing that neither of them had a life preserver, Ripley went back down and quickly returned with one for each of them. As they secured their life preservers, freight clerk George Englehart, who was assigned to lifeboat number 10, spotted the two and pushed them into the boat. Commanded by Frank Camp, the small boat was launched just as the Rio turned over onto her side and made her final plunge. Camp cried out, "For God's sake, shove off, she's sinking," as an explosion inside the ship sent shrapnel flying at the boat. They rowed as hard as they possibly could, just barely missing masts and rigging that went smashing into the water all around them, destroying another nearby boat. Kate West recalled that their salvation was due to the heroic, almost superhuman efforts made by those who were rowing the boat clear of the wreck. There were others who maintained a cool head after the collision. Steerage steward Harry Donahue immediately reported to the captain for orders after the collision, and he was told to get passengers on deck. He went below and helped 58 passengers escape the depths of the ship. The racial divisions in steerage left many of the Asian passengers to fend for themselves. 37 Asian steerage passengers lost their lives. Only 9 survived. Donahue helped load passengers into the boats as the ship dropped out beneath him. He climbed the rigging, but soon found himself in the water. He floated for around 15 minutes before finally being picked up by lifeboat number 10. With their designated lifeboat, commanded by Dr. O'Neill, unusable, the Wildman family was taken to the boat charged to 3rd Officer Charles Holland. Harbor pilot Frederick Jordan personally escorted them to the boat, which was already being lowered. They had to climb down a rope ladder into the small boat, and Mrs. Wildman was afraid to leave the ship and proceeded down the ladder very slowly. As Jordan was carrying one of the children down the ladder, the ship made its final plunge, throwing all of them into the water. The boat they were loading was violently smashed in two when the Rio turned over, sending her aftermast flinging through the boat as it crashed into the water. Jordan resurfaced and was able to cling to some wreckage before being picked up. He never saw the Wildman family again. 3rd Officer Holland also somehow managed to survive. Ironically, Dr. O'Neill's lifeboat was righted and successfully launched. They were picked up by another ship a few minutes later. Shinji Yamada didn't have time to find a boat before the ship turned over and threw him into the water. He was stunned for a moment, but soon regained consciousness and swam to the surface, where he soon found a raft with 4 other men on it. The raft drifted for around 20 minutes before they were picked up by one of the lifeboats. The end came suddenly and violently for the Rio, catching many off guard. As soon as the ship's stern filled with water, it dislodged the ship from the rocks. Free from the perch, the ship immediately capsized and sank. Her final moments were absolute chaos, and accounts differ, but the city of Rio likely sank in only around 20 minutes. Later that morning, MJ Fitzgerald, an employee at the Merchants Exchange in San Francisco, was waiting for news of the long overdue city of Rio. He figured that the ship was just waiting out the fog when he saw a fishing boat approach the wharf, towing a lifeboat with the letters City of Rio de Janeiro on its bow. The survivors were picked up by nearby ships, mostly local fishermen. Of the 220 or so people on board, only around 85 survived. It was the deadliest disaster in the San Francisco area until the Great Earthquake of 1906, only a few years later. Kate West and Frances Ripley were 2 of only 3 women to survive, along with Gabrielle Larahin. When asked by reporters why so few women survived, Frances Ripley observed that men always managed to take care of themselves. The crew at the 4-Point Life-Saving Station only officially became aware of the disaster when they got the call from Fitzgerald at the Merchants Exchange at 7:40 that morning, nearly 2 hours after the accident that unfolded less than a mile from the station. While lookout Mark Ellingson later claimed that he didn't hear anything, testimony from Private Harry Taylor and other sentries on duty at the time at the nearby Fort Point Barracks contradicted his testimony, proving that the Rio's distress signal was audible on land. The life-saving service was heavily criticized for failing to act. With so many conflicting reports, it was difficult to assign blame for the disaster. Harbor pilot Jordan claimed that Captain Ward pressured him to get underway as soon as possible, but this went against numerous other witnesses who reported that the captain was in no rush and many believed that Jordan was at fault. Captain Ward died in the sinking, so he was unable to account for his actions. Today, most residents of San Francisco probably haven't heard of the city of Rio. The lives on board are just another footnote in history. Something you might read about on a plaque by the sea and forget about by the time you get in your car. But for the people on board, their hopes and dreams, their fears and anxieties, all came to an end that day, right where the base of one of the most famous landmarks in the world now towers over the water, defying the forces that claim so many lives and daring us to believe that we will live forever.